Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to this ongoing series of conversations organized by the Turkish Presidential Communications. I am Adeshawa Josh, and I'll be moderating this panel on the future of the Türkiye-Africa relations. Just a quick, broad background to why we're having this conversation. Turkey's role and influence in Africa has risen steadily across several sectors in the last 2 decades, from education to economy, diplomacy, defense, and cultural exchange. And this has translated into stronger ties with the continent as Turkey's strategic framework of a win-win policy catches on, mainly driven by economic, humanitarian, and security dimensions. So what's the future of these relations at a time when countries like the US, Russia, and China are battling for equal influence? All right, joining me on this panel, 3 wonderful people I respect a lot. Doğan Eşkinat, an international relations expert at Turkey's Directorate of Communications. I've Çeta Mwanze, he's a global politics expert and lead partner at SBM Intelligence. And I have Abdinot Dahir, Managing Director, Talofort Consulting Group, and an expert on Turkey-Africa relations. He's joining me from Istanbul. Çeta is joining me from Lagos, and Doğan is joining me here from Istanbul. All right. So my first question, you all are going to jump in, but here's just to give you a rounded perspective of what it is. The U.S. has just recently overhauled its policy towards Africa with the objectives to reflect its updated ambitions on the continent and strengthen its influence. Many other countries are either updating or also overhauling their diplomatic relations with the continent, as seen in the increase in the number of Africa-focused summits held around the world every year. So what does this say about Africa's positioning in the current world order? And is there yet again another scramble? I'm directing this question towards Çeta Mwanze.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. Personally, I don't think that there is a change in focus. I think that unfortunately, we are still, what we are seeing is just an evolution of the old way of looking at Africa, and it's the clue comes from the very first thing. When you say Africa, we have to ask ourselves, what is Africa? Abdino is from Somalia. Somalia is probably the only country in Africa that is homogeneous ethnically and linguistically. I'm from Nigeria. And you are from Nigeria, and both of you know that if I'm speaking my Igbo language and you are speaking your Yoruba language, we will not understand each other. We're essentially 2 nations in one. And that is just being polite. Nigeria is in reality more than 200 nations in one. So when people come with an Africa focus, it tells me that they haven't taken the time to understand what Africa's issues are, what the issues of the various African peoples are. And what we're just seeing is a continuation of old imperialistic ideologies. There's a gap that is opening up on the continent. France is being chased out, for example, in the Sahel. France is an old colonial power, and when that is happening, other people step in. Turkey, for example, has much older ties to various groups within the African continent, the Sahel, the Sahara, going into sub-Saharan groups, and they are trying to use those old ties to get back into the fray. But events such as the unfortunate earthquake that happened a few months ago can only slow down Turkey's incursion into the continent. What gives Turkey an advantage is those old historical ties, which many people, for example, in northern Nigeria, remember and will gravitate towards. There's also the commonality of religion, Islam. However, having said that, the people who are at the most advantage right now are the Chinese, the Chinese simply because they have the money. They have the money and they have something that the Western powers do not have, which is they tend to respect people's culture, at least on the surface of it. They are not, they don't attempt to tell us this is what you should do, this is how you should do it, and all of that. The Russians also act in a very aloof manner, but the Russians mainly come from the angle of security. So everybody has something that they're bringing in. But the overarching point still remains: do they look at us for who we are, or rather some mythical Africa? Remember that if we are just to look at it based on this on the modern nation state configurations, then Africa is 54 or 55 different countries, depending on how you want to look at it. So, for example, the jury is out on whether there's Somalia and Somaliland, or whether Somalia is still one entity. But the point remains, there are 54 or 55 different entities that need to be dealt with, and each of them has their own unique thing that is an issue for them, that people need to reckon with. So I don't think that much has changed. I think that what is just happening, or let me rephrase, I don't think that much has changed in the way people approach the continent. But what has changed is the fact that people within the continent are getting a lot more assertive. Many of them are now physically tired of old imperialistic attitudes, and are making efforts to throw those away. Again, that's because the old imperialistic arrangements have failed, and that is increasingly clear. So there's opportunity, but people need to update their attitudes in order to actually make use of that opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Cheta. I'll let you join in here, Abdinor, because I see you nodding your head. And so if you would, do you have anything to add to what Cheta has said?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would like to reflect the same question as well, and I appreciate the contributions of my fellow panelist, Cheta. Why so many foreign countries, powers, including the Western, the US, are updating their policies and going back to Africa? They have been in Africa, but again, most of the time, the new literature, new discussions, most of the time talk about the new scramble in Africa. But I would argue against that, and I would say now the futures in Africa, the Africans have more, voice now in the global arena and global platforms, and also because Africa has a market. The population is rising. In the next few decades, we will see Africa beating Asia, hopefully. Nigeria leading, and Ethiopia, most of the populations in Africa will triple, and that means the global trade in terms of consumer markets will shift into Africa, and while the Western countries are aging in terms of population. So, and that's one thing. And again, in general, Africa's massive natural resources as well. So these are the reasons why a lot of foreign powers are interested in Africa. But at the same time, Africa's place in the global order is changing. Africa looks like to have more a common voice in certain matters in the global discussions, and so these will make an Africa an attractive continent, and the powers that are coming to Africa, as Cheta said, I know Turkey is different, in my opinion, than them. Turkey has, in the last 2 decades, invested in Africa's development architecture. It has also engaged in kind of equal relationship, which is in other times on win-win situation. So going forward, we see Turkey's investments in Africa as looking for partnerships as well as economic opportunities at the same time, while increasing Africa's collaborations in global platforms like South-South collaborations, and looking for common opportunities in the global platforms like Turkey and Africa. They see themselves as marginalized in global platforms because they are not included in the UN Security Council, and Turkey is known for advocating for reform in the UN Security Council, and collaborations with Africa, with different African countries, and a more political engagements with them will increase the leverage in the global platforms.
Thank you so much, Abdinur. I will turn my attention now to Doğan Eskinat. I just want to ask you quickly, Abdi touched on it a little bit, talking about Türkiye-Africa relations, and he described it as a win-win policy towards the continent. And every chance you get to listen to Turkish ministers and people from the presidency, you always hear the same approach, the win-win approach, a partnership that builds on equity and genuine progress on both sides. What is that like? Talk us through what that concept is, and is it on track to deliver its set objectives, and what are they really? That win-win thing. I mean, I understand it in the English terms, but in the policy terms, what is that?
Well, thanks, first of all, for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to join you. So on this, I think it's important. So from a Turkish perspective, it's important to note that sort of Turkey's engagement or terms of engagement with African nations reflects a broader sort of interest in the world and sort of how Turkey wants to be treated by others, specifically the West. So in this sense, we see that it hasn't really sort of positioned itself, for instance, against any other country or any other country's interests in Africa. It's just been part of, for instance, the engagement with African nations has been part of a broader effort to develop stronger relations with the non-Western world, let's say, and to play a more active role in global and regional politics. So you see, as Turkey expands its sort of diplomatic network in Africa, you also see an expansion of those diplomatic networks in sort of the Far East or Latin America. So it's not an isolated event. At the same time, on this sort of equity and sort of this genuine partnership, it's also Turkish governments have consistently demanded from their specifically Western counterparts. That's what that's how Turkey wants to be engaged with on this equal footing, and it's applying these principles also to its relations with African nations. So we can say that it reflects this broader sort of trend in how Turkey and Turkish people view the world.
Well, that's interesting. I like the way you put it, that this attitude towards foreign diplomacy, for foreign relations, is not just targeted at Africa, but Turkey is treating its partners the way it wants to be treated. It's a broad policy, whether it's towards Africa, whether it's in Latin America, which is great. Well, whether it wants to compete or not, though, in Africa, there's competition. Okay, between all these different, shall I say, Western partnerships that the continent has. I would ask you, do you think that Turkey's relations as compared to other countries that are also, trying to influence on the continent, do you think it is different? And is it working? I'm still directing that question to you.
I think what distinguishes Turkey is that it is a developing nation. It's not a developed nation. And I think in this sense, that enables sort of Turkish officials, companies, NGOs, what have you, to, operate in the space more easily, because guess what? You face similar challenges, maybe not the same challenges, but some similar challenges. And I think that, that gives the country a unique ability to understand and appreciate, how to tackle those. And I think it also affects how it's being perceived. And I think it also sort of supports this claim to having these win-win relationships, or, to having these genuine partnerships of equals. So in that sense, I think it comes from a different place than many other, let's say, players or stakeholders in the continent.
Right. So I'm going to come back to you, Doan, but can you do me a favor? Can you like fix your audio? It's a bit on, it's not very clear. The tech team is telling me now that the output is very poor. So I'm gonna like maybe log out and then log back in, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay, thank you. So Cheta, I will come to you with this question that I asked him. Whether or not Turkey wants to compete, there is competition for influence on the continent. And Turkey uses the word win-win partnership. You've used the word imperial approach. Does Turkey have a different sort of approach to its relations on the continent? And do you agree with Doğan that because Turkey is also a developing country, it sort of understand the unique challenges that many African countries have, it can relate to it, and it is approaching it in that sense of win-win. We're going through the same thing. We can share some of the tips of how we have been able to overcome some of our challenges and perhaps even learn from you in a way. Do you agree?
I agree with most of what Dogan said. It's an advantage that's not just Turkey, but China and also India have. These countries are not too far away in terms of their income per capita from where most African nations are. And indeed, they were in this position as recently as 30 years ago. So when you have such a situation, there's an empathy that they have. It's very easy for them to put themselves in African shoes. And as a result of that, they can speak the language that Africans will understand and that Africans will connect with. Aside from that, the Eastern approach, if you may, in terms of developmental economics, tends to actually be more, and I would borrow Dogan's language again, win-win. We tend to have there's a tendency to have an approach of, oh, live and let live is what I would actually prefer to use. That's both of us can be accommodated in the same space. It's quite different from what has been, and it's important to say what has been recent Western approach, which tends to be more zero sum. That's okay. In order for me to win, you have to lose. So that is something that most Africans will also empathize with. However, like I said earlier, what is missing in the approach from everybody, not just the West, not just China, not just India, but also Turkey, is the approach of meeting the Africans like we're one block. We're not. Even science will tell you that there's more genetic diversity on the continent of Africa than on any other continent. So we are very different. I think that's something that a lot of people have to look at, is the fact that that's African countries, again, with the notable exception of Somalia, I would add Botswana, I would add the Maghreb countries of Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and maybe a few others. Most African countries are artificial constructs. So we also have internal tensions within these countries that don't make for good long-term planning. That's something that we need to overcome on our own paths as Africans, but it's something that people who want to do business with us need to be aware of, because it's those kind of things could easily derail any long-term prospects. Take my native Nigeria as an example. In Nigeria, you have all sorts of tensions between the regions as to where developmental projects will come. So if businessmen from Turkey are coming in, what is Turkey's main need from Nigeria? It's resources. And those resources would be given in exchange for probably some developmental projects. But then the question becomes, where do we cite those developmental projects? Do we continue with the kind of arrangement that the British had during colonialism, where all of the transport infrastructure in Nigeria was designed in such a way as to take resources from the hinterland to the coast and then out? or do we continue, or do we move in a direction where infrastructure is designed in such a way as to also encourage internal trade within Nigeria so that we can have an exchange of finished goods between Turkey and Nigeria? Those are questions that need to be asked and need to be answered. And until we answer those questions, something that would ultimately hurt Turkish industry, Turkish business that want to work in Nigeria would be the internal instability that Nigeria's own internal contradictions bring. So businessmen, governments from Turkey need to understand better the internal dynamics of the various African countries that they want to do business with.
Wow, that's amazing. And I would say that for the longest time, China had similar problems, and China didn't even want to get involved because they didn't want to get bogged down with the intricacies of those problems. But after losing over and over again and falling short of its own objectives, like being behind 10 years behind what it wanted to achieve, it started to look at how it can, then begin to work with the government and then begin to understand those issues better. And I think after a while, they ended up having their first military base on the continent, something that no one knew that China would resolve to have in the longest time.
Yeah, there's a practical consideration to having that military base in Djibouti, and the Chinese are also having negotiations with Equatorial Guinea. Basically, they need those bases to protect trade routes. It's that simple.
But they wouldn't have the longest time, Cheta, do you agree with me?
Yeah, they didn't have for the longest time, again, because of a lack of understanding of dynamics. At some point, so for example, especially with the Sahel, because again, you have to look at geography. What is Turkey's best chance for trade with, say, Nigeria? It is actually overland routes through the Sahel. So Turkey would probably need to establish some military bases in places that have been vacated by the French, such as Niger, Burkina Faso, because those places stand in the direction of, or in the way of trade. So these are things that will need to be considered over time.
Okay, so I want to ask Abdinor now, and I would want you to join in later, and of course, Doan, is what is Turkey doing great right now? And what can it do better?
Well, I would agree with Cheta that not only Turkey, any foreign actor who would like to do business in Africa should respect and understand the local context and culture and diversity of any country, and not to interfere. So one of the areas where Turkey is doing right in Africa, and especially in East Africa and Somalia, is not to interfere in local issues, in local politics. Turkey has been in Somalia for a decade now, and Somalia has been a failed state for so many years. It is a very fragile nation now. So many competing interests and state fragility and lack of institutions. Every day there's so many conflicts and issues coming up. So Turkey has never been caught up in that. I think it has learned its lesson. That's one dimension. Number two is Turkey respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries it does business with, especially in Somalia. Somalia, there's been a very weak central government for so many years. And when Turkey came, it has said, okay, you have so many mini states and we don't deal with them. We don't do business with them. We only deal with the federal government of the country. And based on that, we collaborate and we have what kind of equal footing with the government. And again, Turkey has contributed to humanitarian action in Somalia, especially in 2011, when we had a very devastating humanitarian situation, which has caused almost 250,000 lives lost. And after that, humanitarian and famine disaster was averted, Turkey has not left. It has contributed to the development efforts, especially in state building projects. And one of the key areas where Turkey invested is the security sector. Turkey has a military base in Somalia, trains the Somali National Army, and the army it has trained, the soldiers it has trained, does not also get caught in the local politics as well. They're very professional. So that's another place where Turkey is doing right in terms of building state institutions and supporting Somali's efforts to rebuild its army. Another, I think which is underestimated is doing business. So Turkey, in Africa, you have Eastern China, let me say, and you have Western. China also most of the time does business. Is not involved in politics, or is not involved in human rights or security, while the Westerns are mostly involved in democracy and human rights and security, and they don't do business. So one of them in politics, another in business. So Turkey is doing both of them in Somalia. They're invested in business. If you go to every corner in Somalia now, every street, you will see Turkish businessmen working, digging streets, building roads and constructions, running schools and hospitals, and businessmen opening shops in Somalia and even restaurants. And when you look at from the political side, you see Turkish government building military schools, the Turkish humanitarian organizations on ground. So they have the additional benefit of sending staff on the ground. So it's rarely, very rare to see Western staff, businessmen on the ground. But Turkey's benefit is also is combining both politics and business at the same time.
So you did mention the Western approach to relations in Africa and how they position democracy and human rights. It's like, if you want a certain level of cooperation in this area, you have to prioritize democracy, human rights, and a couple other things that is attached to the Western policy of the continent. Why do you think that is? And do you think that you don't possibly think that's a bad idea? Do you think?
In some place, I think it's a bad idea, but in some cases, it's a good idea.
Okay.
So I would say some of these aid, as you said, comes with conditions by the Western countries. So, and with this aid, they have their own strategic objectives. Some of those objectives do not respect the local cultures, do not respect and reflect.
They come in terms of democracy and human rights, which that is not, is it too much to ask, or is it hypocritical to ask for that?
I would say in some places, in terms of preventing human rights abuses and in terms of preventing, kind of conflict, it works. But in some places, it's counterproductive. Some places you see, all the time, whenever there is a Western delegation and a Western president coming to Africa, they promote their own Western values and agendas like gay rights and other issues which are not part of our agenda or developments. And with some of these aid and development interventions come with these objectives and with these conditions as well. So this is a counterproductive, and this will only widen the gap between the Africans and the development partners.
Before I go to Doa, and I see Cheta nodding his head and smiling, jump in if you have something.
Well, there isn't much to add to what Abdino has said. Basically, I think it's a pet peeve with so many Africans, the way Western countries preach about democracy and human rights when it suits them, and then when it doesn't suit them, they turn around and back dictators. So let me give a live example. Uganda. I'm not certain that Yoweri Museveni in Uganda can be described as a democratic leader by any means. Democracy is not just about having elections. It's also about the kind of elections and what you do in between those election cycles. He recently passed what I can only describe as a very harsh law. With respect to or the Ugandan assembly here. Museveni has not yet signed, to be accurate, but it's clear that he supports the law. They recently passed a very harsh law with respect to homosexuality, which calls for the death sentence and all of that. And there's been a lot of uproar from the West. The US State Department has said that they would withdraw aid to Uganda. But it turns out that American groups spent more than $27 million lobbying the Ugandan government to pass that law. So how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile that duality of purpose coming from your country? Again, yes, it is okay in my view to criticize or to talk about the internal affairs of other countries, especially when they are not doing very well, but to try to impose your values without a care as to the culture and the mindset of the people in those other countries, or where they are coming from in an evolutionary sense. So take as an example, there are certain things in the Quran that people in a country such as Somalia, and I keep bringing up Somalia because Abdino is from Somalia, that people in Somalia live by. You can't come and impose the philosophies of the Enlightenment of Dante on such people. They have their own, they have where they are coming from, and they have been coming from that position for thousands of years. So how do you try to impose and expect them to suddenly change their way of life in order to conform with yours? And that has been the problem with engagements with African countries from the Western point of view over the last 250 years or thereabouts. It's the place where countries such as Turkey have an advantage because they don't come to try to impose, and that should not change. Don't try to impose you on us. Let us live and let live in an atmosphere of mutual respect, not a paternalistic atmosphere.
Wow, thank you, Cheta. I'm taking this question to Doa now. What would you say is the biggest challenge that Turkey is experiencing in its relationship with Africa now? And while you are at it, I'm going to leapfrog from Cheta's statement about understanding the dynamics of African culture and politics in relation to its history. And the question would be, what do you think, if at all, Turkey is already considering it, that Turkey is doing to invest in the understanding of the politics and culture of Africa to be able to strengthen that relationship? Because remember, every culture and every politics is constantly evolving. So to continue to develop and build on those relationships, you have to continue also to evolve with it. So if you still remember the first question, go for it. Otherwise, I'll ask you. All right.
Sure. Thank you. First challenge is let me quickly wrap up what I think are.
Your connection is a little bit of a challenge, and I was hoping that it would have been fixed by now. So let's go on it. Let's try again. I'm having, it's a little bit difficult, but can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. All right. All right. Go on. Jump on it then.
So before the changes, let me quickly up what I think again.
Go on. This is me again. Hold on. Hold that thought, please. Can you hear me? Do you mind logging out and then logging in again? Your connection is really bad, and now I won't be able to use it. So just log off and then go back in. All right. Okay. All right, guys, it's just two of us now, pending the time it comes back. I want Abdinor to, take a go at the question of how to fix, the understanding that Turkey currently has of us, not fix it, but basically how to evolve, make it evolve and get better. Obviously, where they are right now, I'm sure is not where they're hoping to be in the next couple of years. Is Doan with us now?
Yeah.
Oh my God, you're back. Now I can hear and see you well. What happened before? Okay, so do you want me to ask you again, or do you have the questions well?
I think I got it.
Oh my God, it's better now. All right, let's go.
So let me start by quickly sort of wrapping up what I think the strengths are before talking about the challenges.
Okay.
I think, first, Turkey being a developed nation itself and not having a history of colonialism are definitely very significant advantages. And I think those experiences also make it easier for Turkish officials, companies, and NGOs to communicate and relate with their counterparts in Africa better. Another major advantage is that Turkey has had a strong track record over the last 20 years, because there's a difference between saying you want to create win-win situations and actually doing it. And so in this sense, Turkey has transitioned from sort of promising equal engagement and delivering it. And that has, I think, a lasting impact, because you don't get a second chance at sort of making a first impression. But obviously, there are also challenges. And on the Turkish side, sort of going forward, the main challenge, I think, will be consistency and continuity in certain areas. And I believe that economic and defense partnerships are less prone to this particular challenge. And also diplomatic and political relations are largely immune because there's an established diplomatic network already in place. And this is both in African nations and also in Turkey, where many African nations now have sort of established diplomatic missions. But specifically in newly developing areas like media and communications, I think there's a clear need for continued commitment. And, the best way to deal with that will be to institutionalize those relationships through, different methods. Could be, newsroom exchanges, could be sort of encouraging public officials in Turkey to learn African languages and pursue advanced studies in African politics, economies, cultures. And NGOs and academics too have an important role to play there, because they have, an organic and long-term interest. You'll have to remind me of your second question.
I'm just loving the idea of learning African languages, because we end up learning other people's languages. I don't know too many people who end up learning ours. This is brilliant. It's actually, a brilliant idea, which might actually play an important part in my next question. That is about how Turkey is investing in understanding the dynamics of African culture and politics in order to be able to reframe, retweak, upgrade its policies as the relationship grows.
I mean, I would say, as, coming from working in government, working in Turkish government, I can say there's a genuine interest in anything Africa. And, and that's not without sort of acknowledging, the obvious, Cheta mentioned these, problems with the concept or the idea of Africa as sort of an entity, so I'm not saying, I'm not discarding the sort of differences and the variety, but sort of taking it all in. There's genuine interest. It's so for the average, I think, Turkish person, Turkish citizen and Turkish official, Africa is now very much on the map, on their map, both because sort of the political and diplomatic relationships, economic relationships, cultural relationships have reached a certain, I think, critical level, where it's not, the engagement isn't limited state to state anymore. It's much more sort of widespread, and, people do have African neighbors in Istanbul, or people, do know someone that's doing business in an African country. It's not that odd. I think, going back 20, 30 years, it was kind of, it wasn't odd, but it was, I think, unusual for many people. I think Africa was far more sort of detached from the reality of, living in Turkey. And I think it became a lot more involved through these different channels. So I think it's important to think also in those terms, in terms of, how it's sort of spilled over, these state-to-state relations, how they spilled over to these different domains, could be NGOs, could be academia, and sort of how it's creating this long-term impact, I think. So going forward, I think, after this initial stage, there will be a lot more of, this recognizing this diversity.
I would love to see a Turkish person speak Yoruba or Igbo or Swahili. It would be interesting, and have schools in Turkey. It's the same way they have English schools and French schools, and just to have like a Swahili school. That would be so lovely, and it would speak to the reality of the efforts that is being put into understanding
And let me also, if I may, add this one thing. You know that TRT and Anadolu Agency and other sort of media organizations in Turkey are heavily investing in this sort of this African media space or information space, and, launching these new channels. There's now TRT-Africa, but also, it falls within the scope of, like, for instance, TRT French or Anadolu Agency's French service. And you see also these sort of new, I think, initiatives which are more advanced. Initially, state to state relationship is, I think, a more basic kind of relationship than saying, oh, let us tell these stories together. Let us learn from your experience in a newsroom, and maybe we can contribute to your, like, reporting. And I think the fact that we've now reached that level in the engagement is telling.
That's great. Cheta, as we wrap up this wonderful panel, I wanted to ask you, how should Africa then approach this? Because now we have, I wouldn't say Turkey is a new partner, so to speak, but they are.
Turkey is probably our oldest partner.
Exactly.
Outside of Africa.
Exactly. So, but all of a sudden, but you would agree with me that the partnership has evolved a lot. So it would also really matter how Africa is taking this relationship on, do you think?
Yes, it matters, and Africa needs to sort itself out first. We don't have we don't have a common front, and
you already told us why that is.
yeah,
right?
so yeah, but I mean, nevertheless, we need to sort ourselves out. So if we look at it, at least say on a regional level, there are 4 broad regions on the continent that 5 broad regions that basically act according to their interests, because each of them has a regional hegemon. So you have the West African region with Nigeria as the regional hegemon. You have the East African region with Kenya, sometimes Ethiopia, as a regional hegemon. You have the South African region with South Africa as the regional hegemon. And you have the Central African region where the Congo DR could be the regional hegemon, but because it's been in a state of crisis for 3 decades now, it's Rwanda that is actually acting as a regional hegemon there. So I would suggest that Turkey reach that's it's the interest of each of these so-called hegemons at this point that that is actually the interest of Africa. So you have perhaps 6 countries that are really important: Nigeria, South Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia. I've deliberately left out the North African countries because they have closer ties and they don't have it's very difficult to point out a single point of interest among them. So when we can sort out the relationships with these countries, the rest will eventually follow. But I think that in the last year, Turkey made a strategic error by making it more difficult for Africans to get visas. It's something that needs to be, you can't say you want to be reaching out to people, but at the same time with your right hand and with your left hand, you're making it more difficult for them to come. The same with Turkish businessmen want to come to Africa to do business. Africans also want to go to Turkey to do business. And yes, there will be bad actors that will follow. It's just one of the things that comes with it. Good actors and bad actors will come. One thing that we need to strengthen is cooperation between our police forces to ensure that we get the bad actors before they can do so much damage. So I would, in summary, I would suggest Turkey reaching out to these particular actors, these particular countries, and strengthening their relationships with these, and others around those countries will follow.
Wonderful. Let's also see what Abdinal has to say as we wrap up on this.
Well, I think there are some challenges which Africa and Turkey can collaborate to address jointly. on political and diplomatic front, I don't see a big issue, but security-wise, because this the security sector in Africa is very fluid. You have so many state actors. Some of them, taking up new territories, and I think Turkey has a history of fighting insurgents, the PKK insurgents, for over 4 decades. And I think Turkey can contribute wisely if it, collaborates with security partners in Africa, especially where in the Sahel, as much as it do in the Horn of Africa and Somalia, where Turkey has a presence in Somalia. It also contributes to the anti-piracy operations in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. So as it can replicate this in West Africa and in the Sahel, where there is state fragility. That's number one. Number two is a trade front. There's a huge trade imbalance between Africa and Turkey. The trade volume has increased from 5 billion in 2005 to almost 30 billion now, but that is more Turkish products to Africa than than less African products to Turkey. So I would say Turkey should also open its market to African products, and this will contribute a sustainable a relationship between the two sides. And finally, I would say the media and culture. Turkey is doing well in politics and in diplomacy in Africa, but the media is lagging behind. Turkish local media does not cover Africa's history sufficiently. There's less discussions in media forums on Africa. When you have major conferences which address global challenges and issues, Africa is mostly left behind in Turkish discussions. So I would say the Turkish media should focus on this. And finally, on academia, you have so many African students and academics coming to Turkey to study. That's good, but we have few African professors in Turkey, and few African study courses have been taught in Turkish academic institutions. That means there are less Turkish students who know about Africa. So I would say Turkey should teach African history and African culture and languages in Turkish institutions, so that these people, the students who will graduate from these institutions, will drive in the future the relationships between the two sides. So I would say I would conclude with these recommendations.
Thank you so much, Abdunnoor. Doğan Eskinet, your final word as we wrap up.
Yes, thanks very much again for inviting me. Let me just sort of wrap up by saying that first, as Abdunnoor said, I agree that there's a lag between sort of these newer areas like media and sort of more political, diplomatic, economic relations. But I think there's a strong sort of commitment to catch up on that front. As Adashiva knows, we hosted last year in May, we hosted Türkiye-Africa Media Summit. And then we hosted a workshop before the Kenyan elections in Nairobi. And I think there's a stronger commitment there, and hopefully that will continue. And likewise, I think in academia, I'm starting to get on the older side. So I remember no African academics in Turkey. That's, I think, changing, and you see progress there. And it doesn't happen overnight. But I think, as you said, as this engagement and these contacts increase, I think it will contribute. I think also to increasing or strengthening this interest at the grassroots level, and hopefully, I look forward to be part of that and witnessing that. Thanks again very much for inviting me.
Wow, thank you so much to all my panelists. And on that note, it's a wrap on the future of Africa relations as part of a series of conversations organized by the Turkish Presidential Communications. A big thank you to Doğan Eskinet, an international relations expert at Turkey's Directorate of Communications. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Chetan Wanze, a global politics expert and the lead partner at SBM Intelligence, who joined us from Lagos. Thank you so much. Abdunnoor Dahir, Managing Director, Talafot Consulting Group, and an expert on Turkey-Africa relations. The three of you have been phenomenal, and thank you for an amazing conversation. I'll see you next time.